Hello guys, and today's video is another installment in our weird ammo series. Firstly though, I would like to give a shout out to the almighty Ego, who very kindly provided some of the information that I used to make this video. Their channel will be linked down in the description, and oh boy, do we have some oddballs to go over today. We're going to be going all the way from 1914 to the modern day, so buckle in, boys. And don't forget to smash that like and subscribe, because we're getting into the video. So, our story starts with the 10 centimeter M14 Feldhaubitze, which entered service in 1914 with Austria-Hungary. And you might be wondering, as you can see a pizza truck in the background, what does this have to do with our funny Italian boy in the deserts of North Africa, you might ask? And usually we clown on Italy's military, but this cannon entering Italian service is a direct result of the greatest Italian military victory of the 20th century, the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. This battle, which took place in late 1918, saw Italy smash the disintegrating Austro-Hungarian army and directly caused the capitulation of Austria-Hungary and the collapse of its empire. During the battle itself and the armistice thereafter, Italy ended up with thousands of these cannons and put them into service as the Obice da Cento. I'm not going to pretend that that was good pronunciation. But this cannon was still in service with the Italian border guards, some of which were deployed in Libya at the start of World War II, which is how it ended up in North Africa. The cannon was then mounted on the back of the widely available Lancia supply truck as a mobile anti-tank platform. And so finally we come to the truck that we all know and love. And actually, this is the first vehicle to be featured twice, because in an earlier video we were talking about the anti-concrete shell, whereas today we're going to be talking about Effetto Pronto da Cento, or in-game the HES shell. Now, in real life, this was intended to be a heat shell, high explosive anti-tank, but in practice it didn't really turn out that way. For a heat shell to work properly, they need to detonate at a specific distance from the armor. Without going into too much detail, if it's too close or too far away, when it detonates, it just won't have the penetration it's intended to. And because this Italian shell used a rounded head and an unreliable base fuse, it made it more often than not function like a HES shell. Not by design, but more by accident. And here on screen is a diagram of a HES shell and the Italian Effetto Pronto shell side by side, so you can see the similarities. They both use a base fuse, they both used a hollow rounded head. The difference is that the Italian shell has the cone as well, like a heat shell is supposed to, but what tended to happen is the entire head of the shell would get squashed in before the base fuse would detonate the shell, and it would work like HES. Now, we know this wasn't intentional because only a year or two later, they switched to the German style of nose fuse to correctly detonate it, and then it worked like a proper heat shell. Still, when these things arrived on the Eastern Front, it didn't stop the massive explosive charge in this shell from caving in the side of T-34 turrets, as shown in this image here. And moving on from things that squash, we'll talk about things that don't. And specifically, early APFSDS, which was a direct descendant of, well, as the British called it, APCR, armor piercing composite rigid. The Americans called it HVAP, high velocity armor piercing. And in German, it was known as Hartkern, or hardened core. Essentially, these were all the same idea, but developed independently by multiple nations. You know, some copied each other, there was a lot of back and forth, but essentially, this was either a hollow or very light shell containing a very dense penetrating core that would be used to defeat thick armor. And, well, if you're going to improve this, the next step was to just discard the shell when you exit the barrel. You know, then you've got a smaller, faster, more aerodynamic projectile, thus giving us discarding saber. An example is shown here with the 17-pounder APDS, which was one of the first widely used APDS shells. Notice the bulbous shape of the penetrator. We will be coming back to that. But the next step in improving this design was to stretch out the projectile and add fins at the back for more stable ballistic flight. This prevents the projectile from tumbling in flight, which was more of a problem as the projectile got smaller and smaller. But if you just simply elongate the outer casing of the shell, you get something like Soviet BM-22, which entered service in the 1970s. And here you can see the penetrating core of a 3BM-22 APFSDS shell, not from any sort of, literature or, maybe like a research journal. No, this was just some Russian guy trying to sell random pieces of ammo cores for some reason. But yeah, you have him to thank for the lovely photograph you're looking at. Well, the next step to increase penetration yet further would be to use an increasingly heavy penetrator, which brings us to M735. And much like other early American APFSDS shells, this uses an elongated yet bulbous shape, as shown here with a diagram for XM578E1, which is another early American APFSDS shell. But again, why the bulbous shape? You notice even the APDS shell from earlier had it. Well, if you've ever played with British APDS, you will know the answer to this question already. To prevent shattering. Because generally speaking, if something gets harder, it also becomes more brittle. Which means instead of deforming or squashing like soft things tend to, they just shatter. And you've got to remember, material science wasn't what it is today in the 1960s and 70s, so using a longer, thinner penetrator just wasn't really feasible with the technology of the day. For the most part, they were still using tungsten carbide like they were in the 1940s. I think I read somewhere that specifically the American shells were like 97.5% tungsten. Don't quote me on that. But yeah, any projectile constructed in the modern way as a long rod penetrator would simply shatter on impact. So a bulbous nose was used to spread out the force of the impact to help resist shattering. And so these bulbous penetrators kind of tread the line between these earlier shells like APCR and APDS and modern long rod penetrators like DM53, for example. But then you might ask, what if we actually want our ammo to disintegrate? Well, then you'd have something like PELE, penetrator with enhanced lateral effect, which is another lovely acronym shell from our friends at Rheinmetall, just like ahead from an earlier video. And when one of these bad boys hits the aluminium skin of an aircraft, it kind of mushrooms out and disintegrates, because the core of the shell is made from a much softer material, sometimes even plastic, which causes huge amounts of stress to the outer casing, which, as we said before, is very hard and quite brittle. Then just throw in some tungsten ball bearings for good measure, and you have 27mm PELE ammunition. And this is kind of to answer a very basic question: how do we have a HE shell without the explosive filler? But honestly, preceding that, you might even ask, why do we even need a HE shell without the HE? What's the point? And yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Well, the first reason is that it reduces the risk of the ammunition exploding if it's hit or exposed to fire. Like, ideally, we don't want our aircraft to get hit, but when they do, it is generally preferable if they don't just explode. And obviously, there is still the risk with the propellant, but it's much less dangerous because propellant at the end of the day is a low explosive. It doesn't actually explode per se, it burns. It burns very quickly, but it's nowhere near as energetic as high explosive is. And it tends to be harder to detonate. Not always true, but obviously you don't want it to be easy to detonate. You only want it to detonate when you want it to detonate. And then you have the other thing. What if you miss? Because at the end of the day, you are going to miss quite a lot. And what if your cannon shells then fall to the ground over an area that happens to have civilians? If all of the effects are kinetic and caused by, it hitting something at extremely high speeds and there are no explosives in it, well, the actual munition isn't going to take somebody's hand off if they pick it up and don't know what it is. This makes it much safer for ground crews as well when they're handling the ammunition for the same reason. There's much less chance of accidents happening. And there's been a big trend in Western militaries to move towards so-called insensitive munitions. I mean, you can also take a look at C4 plastic explosive. You can actually set it on fire and it still won't explode. Because really, we want to make sure that the munitions we create only cause damage exactly when and as intended. Currently, this is only found on the various models of the Gripen. And, I mean, let's be honest, it's not particularly useful in game because, well, I mean, how often do you use your cannon on another player at top tier? You're lucky if you can get within 20 kilometers of another plane these days. And last but not least, we have APDS-HEI, or armor-piercing, discarding sabot, high-explosive incendiary core, which is found on Chinese helicopters. And honestly, I was a bit puzzled by this initially because, well, as we talked about earlier with armor-piercing, discarding sabot, the whole point is to have a very thick, dense, usually tungsten or tungsten carbide core to help increase penetration. So if it has explosive filler in the core, then it's not going to weigh as much, which kind of defeats the whole point of it being a discarding saber round in the first place, right? Like, as far as I'm aware, what they're probably referring to is APDS-HEI, or an incendiary discarding sabot, in 12.7 by 108mm Soviet. Now, I couldn't actually find any APDS round with an explosive core, even after spending quite a few hours browsing various websites. I'm not saying that this is, definitive research, but I couldn't find anything. Now, I was thinking explosive could be referring to the core fragmenting, and the incendiary effect may be coming from the molten jacket, because sometimes these very hard cores are coated in a thin layer of another metal like steel or aluminium, which actually melts when it impacts a target, and that can cause an incendiary effect. But I could only find one 12.7 by 108 Chinese APDS round, and this thing doesn't have a jacket to melt. And images of the cores after firing that I found show that they're just made of straight up tungsten. They don't even shatter, they just deform. And from what I understand, I did find an image of a box of this ammo, and the writing on the box, I think, says tungsten core, steel casing, which is referring to the casing that the propellant is contained in. Now, honestly, I have no idea, so if you speak Chinese and this is an incorrect translation, let me know in the comments down below. The other possibility is that it's referring to a specialist armor-piercing incendiary sniper round called DBJ-10, but this doesn't have a discarding sabot, so I don't think that is going to be the answer either. So honestly, I'm at a complete loss here, guys. But the one thing we can all agree on, I assume, is that machine gun pods on helicopters are some of the most useless weapons in the entire game, because you're often going to be replacing rockets or ATGMs to carry them. So hopefully you can appreciate that I actually went through the effort of destroying something using this terrible weapon, even if it did take me down in the process. So yeah, today I went into a little bit more historical detail this time because people have said in the past that they enjoy that kind of thing and that's what they enjoy about the videos. So I thought, hey, I'll focus a bit more on it this time. So let me know if you guys prefer this style or, would prefer it if I actually talked about the in-game vehicles a bit more and how the ammo is used in-game. Either way, I hope you guys liked the video. Thank you for coming and I'll see you in the next one.